Okay, hello everyone. So I'm just going to give you hopefully a short summary of what's happening in the middle of the New Kingdom and certainly towards the end. Um, we talked a little bit about Amarna last week and how there was the worship of the sun and how it changed a lot of things. Really interesting too from that particular time period is that we have a bunch of letters between the Egyptians and a bunch of people living in the north. It's written in a different script, so Babylonian cuneiform, which means some people in Egypt must have been able to read that. And it really talks about the diplomatic relations between the two countries, and of course really reveals the rise of the Hittites, which is a group of people living in the north. And it's really interesting, the whole collection. Now, what I would tend to do if we were doing this in class is to put up some of the primary text, give you a few minutes to read it, and then we talk about it. But since this is a video, what I'm going to do is just introduce this letter really quickly, and then I'll let you turn the video off, and then you can read it. So this is a letter from the king of Babylon to Amenhotep III. And what he's really talking about is the fact that Egypt doesn't send, the Egyptian pharaoh doesn't send his daughters out to get married. And this king is wondering why he hasn't sent him a new wife. So go ahead and stop the video and go ahead and read that and then move on to the next bit. And then you've got the rest of this letter. Actually, it's not the rest. You can look up these letters online and I'll see if I can give you the link in our class. And then this is another letter. This is from the king of Hatti to Akhenaten. Remember, Akhenaten is the king who ended up changing the religion. And it's pretty much asking, why isn't he doing what his father did, Amenhotep III? And so this king is asking Akhenaten to do the same things. And then again, I want to go ahead and stop the video and read the rest of this. Okay, you might have not have heard of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, but you certainly heard of their son. His name was Tutankhaten, and as you can see at the very end of his name, let me get my pen up here. Aten is the sun god. Now, we don't know exactly when this king took over, but this is actually King Tut. So what happens is that they probably had a regency going where Akhenaten and Tutankhaten were ruling about at the same time, just training him up. And then when Tutankhaten became king, he ended up pretty much getting rid of this whole idea of a monotheism, if that's what we can call it. And he started to restore the traditional religions, especially with the god Amun. And he ended up changing his name, Tutankhamun. So that's probably the name that you're more familiar with, or King Tut. Now, he didn't rule that long, and you know, a lot of us have heard of King Tut, so I'm not really going to go into all the material finds in his tomb, which are pretty amazing, especially if we're thinking about sustainability and where all this material wealth came from. Then you find that the next pharaoh, Horemheb, started to get rid of this whole idea of Amarna and the king and this whole rule of the sun god. And so what they ended up doing is pretty much rewriting history and taking that particular time out of Egyptian history. And then, you know, all these details aren't totally important, but what we start here right after this is that we get the rule of someone who changed his name to Ramses I. And this starts a whole dynasty with pharaohs who are named Ramses I, Ramses II, Ramses III, and so on. The very first pharaoh to really make a big impact was Seti. And he built massive, massive temples, massive buildings. He built shrines for the various gods. And then, of course, we've talked about this at the very beginning, where we've got Seti's Kings List, which tells us quite a bit about the history of ancient Egypt. And then you've got some of this temple. This, I don't know if you can see back here, these are people standing here with these massive pillars. And I put the height here, 70 feet tall. There's 122 columns. Some of them are 40 feet tall, the ones that aren't the tallest. And so again, think about sustainability, how much effort it took to remove the stone from where it naturally was, carve it, set it up, and the whole thing. It's pretty amazing. He was buried in the tomb, the Valley of the Kings, and we talked about that a little already. We know that Ramses II ruled for a very long time, at least 60 years, probably 66 years. And in that time period, and which I guess wouldn't be a real surprise, he had time to build quite a few buildings. And sometimes it wasn't just like new stone dug out of the side of a hill. He reused some of the monuments, and especially those blocks that we talked about last week. And then, of course, like a lot of pharaohs, he declared himself to be a living God. And then here's some very famous statues of him with his mother and his queen. Pretty amazing. You can see that they're almost 70 feet tall. Again, think of sustainability and how much effort it took to do this. We do know, too, that moving on to the next pharaoh, Ramses II, is that we have wars with the Hittites, especially this was taking place in Syria. So we've got, again, this big movement of Egyptian troops going north. And you've got a very famous battle called the Battle of Kadesh. It was with the Hittites in 1275 or maybe 1274 BC, not quite sure the date. It's a really interesting battle because we end up seeing two very different sides of the story based on which text you're looking at. So Ramses II had a whole bunch of texts written up about this and how he was the savior of the day and he single-handedly destroyed the enemy. But you can look at texts from the Hittite side and they say, Ramses II pretty much hightailed it home. Scholars tend to believe now that the battle was probably equal. So no one won, and then both of the rulers ended up going home. But again, it's really interesting to think about the text written for Ramses II and how he's declared to be the victor, and he probably wasn't. This is another very famous carving showing the beating of the spies. So they had captured some spies, and in fact, some of the spies had given the Egyptians wrong information, which really hurt them during one of the battles. We do know, however, that during the same period, you've got problems with the Hittites. And this led, probably right after the battle, to a peace treaty and then what we call like a defensive alliance, meaning if one is attacked, the other one will come to help. And we get some of these diplomatic marriages. I've showed you some of the texts from before. It was very similar. Now, this doesn't mean that Egypt just sat by and believed these peace treaties. The Egyptians ended up sending more troops into Palestine just to make sure. We also know that Ramses II also went into Nubia. Now, the Egyptian society starts to change during this period. You've got more people, we could call them foreigners, coming in. And if you remember, this is what led to the Hyksos rise. Now, the same thing didn't happen here, but we've got Libyans moving into Egypt. We've got Palestinians. And we can look at the archaeology to show that there are new gods being brought in. And that really helps us to determine where these people came from. And sometimes this particular period is called a Cosmopolitan age because you've got all these different cultures mixing up in Egypt and living fairly peacefully. Okay, now moving towards the middle end of the New Kingdom. So I already mentioned that Ramses ruled for 66 years. You can tell from all his building projects that everything seemed to be going fine. You've got the next pharaoh, Ptah, and I've given you the dates when he rules here. Now, when he was ruling, Egypt was, I don't know if invasion is the right word, but there's a group of people that attack and they're called the Sea People. We don't know exactly who the Sea People are. We don't know exactly where they're coming from. Maybe it's Libyans, maybe it's Palestinians, and I'll talk about this in a bit, but they affected a wide number of civilizations during this particular period. Now, I've got this long text here. This was at the Temple of Karnak, and why don't you stop the video and read through it. But what it is, it's about how Ptah pushed the the sea people out. And then here's a bit more of that particular text, so go ahead and stop the video and read through it. Okay, so now we move on to the next pharaoh, Ramses III. Now this is where things really start to get interesting because you start to see the decline of the new kingdom. Now we've talked about how Ramses II was pushing up into Palestine, he's pushing into Nubia. Usually when this happens, we've seen this pattern before, the Egyptians get overextended. And then we start to see some economic problems. Now, I will talk in another lecture about Deir el-Medina and the strikes that happened. Some of you wrote your essays on this, or already know about what's going on. But we have further invasions of the sea peoples. And I've given you the dates here before. So something is going on with this mass movement of people who are invading Egypt and other territories. And this is a close-up of one of the drawings of the sea people. And we haven't really talked about this, but if you look at the iconography of how Egyptians draw themselves and how they draw foreigners, they look very different. It's also interesting too, and this probably leads to the downfall of the new kingdom, you get the rise of priests. Now remember, we've got some parallels here. If you remember, we looked at the Old Kingdom, the end of the Old Kingdom, you've got the rise of the nomarchs. So towards the middle end of the new kingdom, you've got the growing power of the priests. And one thing that really hurt the economy is Ramses III donated a whole bunch of agricultural land to a temple, plus a massive number of servants. So every time that agricultural land is given up to a temple, it's not taxed. So that means less income going into the state coffers. So that causes lots of issues. And before I talk about this slide, we will talk about the strikes at Deir el-Medina of the pyramid workers. So lots of things were happening at the same time. Now, there is some really interesting stuff about the death of Ramses III. I can't move my slides back and forth because of the way this recording is, but there's something called a harem conspiracy, and Ramses III was probably assassinated. We have sort of the trial transcripts of how a number of people in the royal household were brought in, put on trial. So go ahead and stop the video and read through this. Don't worry about all the details and the names, just sort of get the gist of what is going on. And then here is the more of this trial transcripts. And this is, on this side, this is Ramses III. So when they found his mummy, he had this sort of thing wrapped around his neck. And what they ended up doing is taking it off, and they found that he was actually stabbed in the neck, and that's probably how he died. Now, we also have this unfortunate person. This is probably his son. And this mummy is referred to as the screaming mummy. So this particular person was put in a tomb, unmummified. They put a sheepskin around his body, which was considered to be impure. And it looks like this was the son of Ramses III, who was probably trying to assassinate his father, and it looks like it was successful. Anyway, as you can tell, this was not a good time during the New Kingdom, and things started falling apart pretty quickly. So I've already mentioned, the knife wound and probably his son being involved in the assassination. Now, what's really interesting, and I referred to this a little bit earlier, is that it's not just Egypt having difficulties at this time. It's all the surrounding civilizations. So you've got the Hittites who are starting to fall. You have really serious problems with the Mycenaean Greeks, who are sort of at a high point of their culture in the 1500s BC, 1400s, 1300s. When you get to the 1200s BC, things start falling apart, and then you've got things happening in Syria, Palestine. We do have a text called the Report of Wenamun, and it probably describes the time of Ramses XI, getting towards the very end of the New Kingdom. But it talks about money being stolen from a ship. Now, what's really interesting is that Wenamun, if he actually was writing this, mentions two leaders in Egypt, and he doesn't mention the pharaoh. So he mentions a high priest, and then he also mentions Mendes. Sorry, I can't pronounce that. So this is really indicating lots of issues in Egypt. He's not even mentioning the true pharaoh. And then what we see towards the very end is this loss of the international system and all the trade that happens. Luxury goods no longer flow into Egypt, so it's a big blow to the economy. Egypt loses control of the Sinai, so that's right next to Egypt during the times of Ramses VI. It loses control of the Nubian territories, and we've sort of seen this pattern happening before. With the loss of the economy, the pharaoh becomes weaker. And then, of course, we will talk about the tomb building at Deir el-Medina and the strikes that happen. Now, on my last slide, don't worry about all of these details because it's not really that important. But you've got the last pharaoh of the New Kingdom, Ramses XI. We've got texts that call this, quote, the year of the hyenas when one was hungry. So it tells us a little bit about what's going on. And then we've got a little bit of detail, again, not totally important to memorize any of this, but we've got the loss of Nubia, which I mentioned, and the Egyptians try and take control. They also try and retake control in the north, and they don't do that. So they lose control of the north, where another leader takes control. This starts the next phase of Egyptian history, which is the third intermediate period.